Today we're going to talk about propaganda. And propaganda is used all the time in all different facets of life. Today specifically we're going to talk about how it's used in politics. And the propaganda technique I observed the most is called card stacking. Basically, card stacking is you're presenting somebody an incomplete set of facts or evidence in order to persuade them of your whatever it is you want them to believe. Um, so to read the definition, card stacking. It's a technique of persuasion that attempts to influence opinion through deliberate distortions, as in suppressing information, overemphasizing selected facts, manipulating statistics, and quoting rigged or questionable evidence. So basically, the interest using this technique against you is attempting to give you tunnel vision on a particular issue, so you miss the bigger picture, missing the forest for the trees, so to speak. Now, it works for a number of reasons. If you try to analyze the world, you soon realize it's very complex. The world can be messy. Making sense of its many confounding variables is a difficult undertaking, and people are people. We are lazy intellectually and otherwise. We also don't like uncertainty. So if someone comes along and offers us a real simple solution and they can bedazzle us with a handful of bullet points that support their remedy, many people take that bait. And it's alluring because now they can feel like they have the answer and they don't need to think about it anymore. They have their certainty. They can also feel smart repeating their handful of talking points that they've just been fed. They can even feel superior to others who don't agree with them. They could say, how can others be so dumb? Don't they know the cherry picked facts that just convinced me of the solution? Don't the naysayers even watch CNN? Didn't they read the Fox article that I just read? I swear other people must live under a rock. Or so some might think. But here's my question. If you've only been given part of the evidence, and only the part that supports one conclusion, are you truly enlightened on the subject? What if the people you turn to for information purposefully left out all the data that would have led you to a different conclusion? Or at least would have cast serious doubt on the neat little picture that the card stacker painted in your mind? So this is my challenge to the viewer. Be willing to question what you think you know. Embrace the uncertainty of the universe and the complexity of society. Be open to new evidence and new ways of looking at evidence. Don't let somebody else stack the deck for you so you only see things the way they want you to. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about gun control and some of the card stacking that gun control advocates engage in. And to let my biases be known from the onset, I very much support the Second Amendment. I think an armed civilian population is a good thing in general, and it's a good way. If you have a free society and you want to keep it that way, letting ordinary people own the means to defend themselves is an important thing to have. At the most basic level, if somebody's breaking into my house in the middle of the night, I want the means to be able to protect myself. And calling the police, best case scenario, it's going to take them minutes to respond, which is just too long when seconds count. But beyond that, just centralizing power in a society where only the central government has arms and they're the only ones with that power, it's just a very dangerous state of affairs. In the last 100 years alone, you have multiple examples of totalitarian states where civilian populations are brutalized by their own government, as well as current day examples of it. I think it's just gullible to believe that that could never happen here. And in fact, if you're gullible enough to believe that, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's only a matter of time. But that's a topic for a whole nother video, I guess, the utility of the Second Amendment. What I want to talk about here mostly is just the rosy picture that gun control advocates like to paint, and they want to make it seem like it's so simple. If we just had some common sense or some reasonable gun laws enacted, that it would solve our woes. And it's my belief in the case that I'm going to make here that to get to that point, it's a gross oversimplification of the data, and they have to ignore a lot of outliers to get to that conclusion. So some facts about me. I do enjoy discussing politics. Just because for me it's more of an intellectual exercise. I do have my own opinions, but I also like listening to a variety of different views on a subject. If for no other reason than to understand other viewpoints and sometimes challenge my own. Maybe there's data out there that I haven't seen that might, slightly nudge my worldview in one direction or the other. But also, as a general rule, I try not to have deeply held views about subjects I don't know a whole lot about. Some people are, in my opinion, overconfident in their opinions because they accept things without really researching them and really figuring out what they actually think on a subject. They just sort of accept something, particularly in politics. It's really easy to do this because, at least in America, you have two parties and they both come with like a prepackaged set of prescriptions for a whole variety of different issues. So if you agree with them on one thing, it's really easy just to accept the whole basket and agree with them on everything else. For example, maybe someone has really strong views on abortion and they side with the general position of the Democrat Party on abortion rights. And maybe that issue they're really well versed in, but then smuggled in with that because, oh, I identify with the Democrat Party on this, I'm just going to take for granted they're right about other things, and I'll just accept their views on gun control, accept their views on school choice or whatever. The whole sort of party platform gets smuggled in for the ride. And the result of that is people have really strong convictions on things often that they don't know anything about. They've just sort of accepted it through osmosis. And there is a tribal element to human nature. It's easy to do things like that. For conservatives, maybe it's, they agree with the Republicans on, tax policy or immigration policy, and smuggle along for the ride is a hard line on marijuana prohibition, which in my view makes very little sense. About as much sense as alcohol prohibition made in the 20s. But because they have a tribal affiliation with a particular political party, it's easy for the rest of their ideas to get smuggled along for the ride that they haven't really thought out. And you'll find this if you have enough political discussions. If you're dealing with an ideologue, and it doesn't matter if they're a Republican ideologue or a Democrat ideologue, if you start pushing back and asking probing questions on, some of their policy positions, in their dichotomous framework of looking at politics, they'll inevitably start accusing you of playing for the other team. It's an us versus them, and if you're not lockstep on our side on every particular issue, if you start to stray a little bit, well, then you're probably a far right extremist or pot leveling liberal hippie with Marxist leanings. But in reality, I'm just a guy that likes to try to find the truth. I like to look at data and wrestle with it. I like to explore ideas and wrestle with them. When I'm presented with a data point, I like to zoom in on it and look at all the different shades of gray. And then I also like to step back and look at the big picture and see how it fits in with other data points. An ideologue that has all the answers generally doesn't like to do that. I mean, they have a very particular resolution level that they want to focus on. They don't want you to get confused with all the confounding variables. They just want you to see the part that supports their conclusion. I find that kind of dog and pony show annoying. And when I encounter people playing that game, whether they're doing it knowingly or because they're just repeating what they've heard from others, I like to push back and try to pick apart what they think they know. So a real common argument for gun control advocates is to point to other countries that have stricter gun laws than America and have a lower homicide rate than the United States. Now, the mistake they make, whether intentionally or just because that's what they've been told, is they cherry pick which countries to look at because there's lots and lots of countries that have much stricter gun laws than the US and have much higher homicide rates. And then there's countries that have really, permissive gun laws where lots of people are armed and have firearms, and they actually have lower homicide rates than some of the countries that they like to cite. So an example was, back in my dating years, I was on a date once, and I try not to be overly political on a first date, but at the same time, like, if the subject comes up, I don't have any qualms about giving my opinions on whatever the issue is. So I'm on this first date, and over the course of talking, uh, about ourselves and what we've done in the past, I brought up that I used to work in the retail gun industry. I used to sell firearms to private citizens over the counter, essentially. So I have some familiarity with the laws in the U.S. and how they work and what you have to do to buy a gun in the U.S. Of course, this prompted her to get into, well, if you look at England, they have really strict gun laws, and look, they have a much lower homicide rate than the U.S. Ergo, it must be because of their strict gun laws. And it's not surprising she's self-identified as liberal, and that's a common argument among advocates of gun control. Which in the U.S. is, I mean, there's people on both sides that support gun control, or people on both sides that support the Second Amendment. But generally speaking, it's a common Democrat talking point to point to, England. It's a great example of gun laws working. So I doubt this idea was original to her. She didn't really research the data and come, oh wow, England, it's this great example of the type of gun policies we should be adopting. More likely it was just something that she heard and now she's repeating because she wants to see how I react to that data. But I'm not new to this discussion, so I'm perfectly well aware that England has a lower homicide rate than the US. But here's the problem with the England example. England has always had a lower homicide rate than the United States for at least the last 100 years. It's always been around 1 or 2 homicides per 100,000 people. And the US has always been significantly higher than that if you look at the US in its entirety. Now, the problem with that is they haven't always had the same gun laws in England. In fact, they didn't start introducing stricter gun laws until the 60s, and then stricter still in 97. Now, why is that important? It's because the homicide rate has stayed flat. They've introduced gun legislation to crack down on, the availability of firearms to make it much more difficult for a private citizen to own and possess firearms. So despite new gun control measures, much stricter gun control measures, the homicide rate stayed basically the same. It stayed at the same low level it's always been. If you're trying to make a causational case for gun control laws helping reduce the homicide rate, well, if there's no net change after your laws, if the homicide rate stays exactly the same, then it's hard to. If there's no correlation, it's hard to show causation. It's not exactly a smoking gun, to use a relevant analogy, as if you pass a bunch of laws to restrict guns and it does nothing to reduce your homicide rate. If the data was different, if you had a really, really high homicide rate, then they pass gun control laws and the homicide rate goes down, you could make that case. Correlation still doesn't prove causation, but at least you would have a case to be made or something to explore. In this case, there's no correlation to start with. And while the homicide rate stayed flat, something that gun rights advocates will point out, their violent crime rate and a number of other categories of violent crime actually went up. And that doesn't prove that banning guns causes other violent crime to go up, but at least in the case of the gun rights advocates, you have a correlation. There could be a case to be made there. Well, maybe if you disarm a population, that population is more likely to be the victim of various other violent crimes, whether the homicide rate goes up or not. I mean, if I'm a criminal and I know the house I want to break into is not likely to be occupied by somebody that's armed, it may embolden me to want to, home invade that household. Same thing with assault. If I know my victims are not likely to be armed, I might be more emboldened to assault them. In either case, if you really look at the whole picture, the UK example isn't the ironclad case that it's made out to be. Now, in fairness, the gun control advocates will say, well, yeah, but look at the mass shootings. But, in my mind, a public massacre is a public massacre, whether it's done with a gun or whether it's done with a bomb, or whether it's done with a guy in a truck plowing into a crowd of people. And in either case, the underlying problem is you have somebody that's psychotic and looking to harm a large group of people for some, whether they're a religious fanatic or a political fanatic or whatever their reasoning is. That's the real problem, is you have somebody with ill intent willing to try to harm a lot of people, and they'll find a way whether they have a gun or not. In my mind, disarming a law-abiding population is just going to help turn them into victims. So anyway, I'm on my date, and the topic of gun control comes up, and she throws the English example at me and says, look at these great gun laws, look at their low homicide rate." And I obviously know this argument, so I pointed out, well, yes, they've always had a low homicide rate, and they had a lower homicide rate before the gun control laws, and it hasn't seemed to impact their homicide rate, so it's not really a good example. And then I brought up an outlier that I know of, which is Switzerland, because everybody loves the Swiss. Well, in Switzerland, depending on which set of data you look at, um, Switzerland is either like third or fourth as far as guns per capita. In some cases, in some lists, you'll see them further down. I'm not sure really why there's a discrepancy there. But in Switzerland, a large percent of the population is in possession of basically military grade firearms. Switzerland, they have compulsory service where, at a certain age, like 18 to 21, able-bodied adults all serve in the military. They all receive military training. That's how their defense plan works in Switzerland. And after military service, it seems a lot of the private citizens there go on to continue to possess firearms in their private residences. So, long story short, in a country of about 8 million people, a lot of them own firearms. Probably, they estimate there's, I think, 3.5 million firearms in Switzerland in private ownership. So, totally different approach than UK as far as firearm ownership goes. However, Switzerland actually has a lower homicide rate than the UK. Now, an outlier like this would seem to cast serious doubt on the hypothesis that more guns equals more homicide, and it would suggest that there's other factors that are eclipsing whatever effect gun control measures might have. And that's why gun control advocates generally don't talk a whole lot about Switzerland. They focus on a handful of developed countries in the West with really low homicide rates. They'll look at England, they'll look at Australia, they'll look at Canada, all of which have lower homicide rates than the U.S. and presumably, to varying degrees, have tighter gun laws, stricter gun laws. But they'll ignore an outlier to the other side, like Switzerland, where there's all sorts of guns all over the place and they have a really low homicide rates. And they'll also ignore outliers to the other side, countries where they have much stricter gun control laws and a much higher homicide rate than the U.S. Say Mexico, for example. It's tougher for a private citizen to get a firearm in Mexico, yet they have a horrific homicide rate relative to the U.S. Same thing with places like Honduras and all these other countries. And when you point out these examples, if you get any response at all from the gun control advocates, it'll be to engage in special pleading to try to explain all these examples away. They'll say, well, you can't look at Mexico. I mean, they're a failed narco state. That's why they have a high homicide rate. It's not because of their gun laws, and it's probably not because of their gun laws, and it probably is because of the cartel violence. But to be fair, I mean, the U.S. shares a several thousand-mile border with Mexico, and the U.S. market is probably the chief market for the cartels. That's where they're shipping most of their drugs. So presumably a lot of that cartel violence, spills over into the U.S. Perhaps if the United Kingdom, which happens to be an island nation, if it instead shared a several thousand-mile border with a failed narco state, perhaps their homicide rate would be a little bit higher. And I've been in discussions before where I point out Switzerland, and they'll say, well, you can't use Switzerland. I mean, they have a low homicide rate because it's an affluent society, or something to that effect. So is it guns that are driving the homicide rate, or is it affluence or lack thereof? If there was a strong case to be made that gun laws or the lack thereof is the driving factor behind the homicide rate in a given area, then you would expect less outliers on both sides. You would expect a clearer story being told with the data. You would expect stricter places with strict gun laws would have low homicide rates, and places with lax gun laws like Switzerland, or relatively permissive gun laws like Switzerland, they'd have a much higher homicide rate. And you would expect the US to be like the homicide capital of the world when we're nowhere near that. We're more towards the middle, actually towards the safer side of the middle when you look at all nations, and yet there's probably more guns in America than there are people. And that's not to say that everybody in America owns a firearm, because obviously, there might be 400 million guns in the country, but some people own several of them, and lots of people don't own any of them. But there's more private guns in circulation in America than any other place on Earth. So if guns and gun laws were the driving factor, then we should be the most violent place in the world, and we're not. We're not by a long shot. And in fact, most places in the U.S. are extremely safe, right on par with places like England or Australia. And most of our violent crime is concentrated in very, very specific areas. And ironically, some of those areas with the just catastrophic violent crime rate and catastrophic homicide rate have the strictest gun laws in the country. So the whole country is under this umbrella of the Second Amendment. But there is some latitude as far as like how states enact gun laws. Like some states are more restrictive than others, and actually particular municipalities sometimes have their own special restrictions on the ownership of firearms. Like in Chicago at one time, it was virtually impossible for a private citizen to own a handgun. Same thing with DC. Yet these areas have some of the highest homicide rates in the country. This is also true of California. As a state, California is one of the most restrictive states as far as. Yet in California, particularly the dense urban areas in Southern California, you have some of the areas with the highest homicide rate in the country. So in my mind, if your proposition is that stricter gun laws help reduce violent crime, in particular homicide, but yet the data is all over the place and there's all sorts of outliers everywhere you look, that would seem to cast doubt on your hypothesis, and you might want to develop a more nuanced worldview and look at other factors that are driving violent crime. If you're a reasonable person seeking the truth and your hypothesis is falling apart in front of you, that might be an indication that you should look elsewhere and try to find a better hypothesis to explain the data. Now, my interpretation of the data is that there is a correlation between poverty and violent crime. And it's not what you might think. There's not a causal relationship there, but rather both are symptoms of a deeper root cause, which is culture and family structure. I think there will always be some homicide in society. It's just part of human nature. Probably half the homicides in the U.S. are more of a domestic nature. It's people killing people that they know that they have a personal grudge against. Say a spouse that gets caught cheating, and the offended party, the person that feels betrayed, uses homicide to take vengeance. It's sort of crimes of passion like that, and that's people are people. That sort of thing is going to unfold at some level. Or one business partner screws over the other, or is perceived to have screwed over the other, and crimes of passion like that. Or somebody enraged over some wrong that they felt is done to them, in a fit of passion, resorts to violence of one form or another. That's why even the safest countries in the world, there's always some level of homicide. And I don't know if you can ever do anything to completely eliminate that. So putting that aside, what are the other main drivers of homicide? Well, who are the people committing the violent crimes? So in any particular demographic that you look at, the most violent part of that group is always going to be on the younger side, and they're always going to be on the male side. So young males, adolescents, probably into their late 20s, early 30s, are going to be the ones committing the most violent crime. Now, why might that be? Well, one obvious explanation is a lot of testosterone in adolescence and into their early adulthood, without a lot of experience or discernment. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's important in judgment and long-term thinking and thinking things through, doesn't completely develop until your mid 20s at best. An experience perspective you only gain with time. So young males with a lot of testosterone, a lot of energy, not a lot of discernment, are going to be the ones more likely to be provoked to rash behavior or more susceptible. Now, that's what's true of a demographic is not true of an individual, so you shouldn't assume that a young male is going to be violent, because most of them are not, but it's that group that most of the violence is going to come out of. Now, in a healthy society, that problem is mitigated in a large degree by culture. You know, older men serve as good examples to the younger men to follow, so that they don't get led astray. While the young man might lack discernment of his own, if he has a lot of good examples to follow, he can navigate that part of his life without veering off into the ditch. Traditionally, that good example is a father figure that's in the home, along with a mother that's trying to raise that young man. And then beyond the home, other examples in the community to follow, other men to look up to that are productive members of society to model yourself after. Now, if you take away those mitigating factors, let's say in an area you have a lot of single parenthood, you don't have a lot of fathers around, and the ones that are around always aren't the best role models. And beyond the home, the community is lacking a lot of positive male role models for young men to emulate, pattern themselves after. Well, then you're left with a situation where you have a lot of male energy and aggression, and it's not being channeled in a positive direction. And in fact, in some areas, you even have a culture that openly celebrates criminality. And instead of positive role models for young males to look up to, they actually have degenerative ones. So young males growing up without a lot, maybe they don't have a stable father figure, maybe they don't have decent other men in their community to give them examples to look up to, and instead they have a degenerative father figure to look up to. They actually celebrate criminality, and being a violent criminal is presented to them as a viable and even desirable life choice. Well, those areas you would expect an explosion in violent crime, and if you look at the data, if you look at the most violent areas in the U.S., they're typically dense urban areas, but not even just dense urban areas. It's dense urban areas with actually very high out of wedlock birth rates, very high single parent households. Communities with a lot of that going on are going to be the most violent areas. And if you start getting granular with the data, you really zoom in on the violent cities and the violent neighborhoods within those cities. My guess is you'll find a really strong correlation between those factors and the violent crime rate. And that's where you should be looking if you really care about the problem, in my opinion. Passing a few random gun laws, banning or cosmetic features on AR-15s, or banning a certain capacity magazine, or this or that, that's going to do very little, if anything, to reduce the homicide rate, as we're really looking at the root causes, speaking truth to those. At least you're correctly diagnosing the problem, in my opinion, and maybe you'll find a workable solution that will actually reduce the homicide rate. But if you've got a better idea, make a response video or leave a comment in the comment section and tell me a better explanation of the data. But coming back full circle to my how I started this video, talking about card stacking and propaganda and that way. My critique of gun control advocates is they often engage in that. You know, they'll point out England's homicide rate, but they fail to mention that, you know, it was always lower, regardless of their gun laws. And the reason they don't bother pointing that out is because they don't actually know, because they haven't bothered to dig into their own argument at all. They haven't tried to challenge their own hypothesis on the issue. Or because they do know and they just left it out because it doesn't support the narrative. If they were really honest with the data and gave you the whole story, well, it's not a clear cut case that they want you to think it is. They also commonly ignore notable outliers like the case of Switzerland, or all the outliers to the other side. All the countries that have really strict gun laws and yet have a higher homicide rate than the average, or even places like the United States that have much more permissive gun laws. And when you look at the United States at a more granular level, and you look at, there's plenty of communities where it's easy to get a firearm and most of the population probably is in possession of them, yet have very low homicide rates, as where areas like Chicago and DC and Detroit, places in California where they have stricter gun laws, have a much higher homicide rate. They ignore all that and just look at the resolution level that supports the general hypothesis. Well, US, one blob of a country, despite being 300 million people plus, I think it's probably 350 now, spread over 50 states, all different types of communities, all different crime rates, most of the country being relatively safe, right on par with the rest of the developed world, and a few outliers that are extremely violent. Rather than look at the picture in its entirety, they just want you to see the United States, one homicide level, which is, I don't know what it is, between 4 and 6, depending on what time frame you're looking at. 4 to 6 people per 100,000 is our national average for a homicide rate, which is about twice of what you find in, say, the United Kingdom or Australia. But they don't really want to dig into the data. They don't really want to show you the full story where, okay, well, yeah, there is a higher homicide rate on average, but it's all concentrated in very specific areas, and they don't really want to look deep into what's going on in those communities because they might come up with a different answer. Maybe guns aren't the problem. Maybe the different gun laws aren't the issue. It's a more complex problem to solve, and it's one that they don't really want to delve into too far, because it might force them to confront some things in their own worldview that they'd rather just leave buried somewhere. Maybe the data point I want to close on, and hopefully this will help provoke some thought, is I want to look at the homicide rate inside of the prison system in the U.S. Of all the environments that you can think of, I don't think you could find many that are more controlled than a prison environment, with the tall walls made of concrete, razor wire on top, keep everybody in. Inside the prison, you have a bunch of individual cells, cages essentially, to keep people locked in and separated from one another. You have very controlled movement of people in a high security prison. And I don't know if you know this, but prisoners aren't allowed to have firearms inside prison. And I could imagine a case where a prisoner happens to steal one off of one of the correctional officers inside the prison, but my guess is that's a pretty rare event. So for all practical purposes, prisoners in prison do not have access to firearms. And obviously it isn't a perfectly controlled environment, because contraband does get inside of prisons. There are drug overdoses, and they're not supposed to have that in prison, and other contraband does get smuggled into prison, but generally it's a very controlled environment. Despite all that, the prison population has a higher homicide rate than the general population by more than double. So you're twice as likely to be murdered inside this extremely controlled environment inside of a prison than you are anywhere else in the country. Well, I shouldn't say anywhere else in the country, but generally speaking, in the rest of the country. Now, why is that? It's because of the makeup of the population. It's what's going on in that population. Well, prison is pretty straightforward example to explain because the way you get into a prison is being convicted of generally a crime serious enough to get you landed into a prison. And I'm sure there's undoubtedly some people in there that were wrongly convicted, and not everybody in prison is a violent criminal, but it's a very selected population with a lot of violent criminals in it. And despite not having access to firearms inside of a prison, it has twice the homicide rate as the general population, which should underscore the cliche thing that gun rights advocates like to say guns don't kill people, people kill people. So in my opinion, we should be looking more at the driving factors that push people into criminality and that help the cultures that help foster criminality, and be less focused on the particular method they choose to commit violent acts with. Because if somebody's highly motivated to do harm to others, that's the root cause of your problem. The particular method that they choose, the particular tool they choose to carry out that harmful act towards others is of less importance, and addressing the ultimate root causes, or at least being honest about them, is more important and far more likely to do a lot more good. You've been watching the Fletch Report. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to hit the like button, leave a comment. For more content like this, you can visit the Fletch Report and consider subscribing.